I'm Doug Burgum, Governor of North Dakota, and grateful to have an opportunity to lead this panel. And thank you. The First Lady was clapping for me. We got one person clapping. That's fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. I just want to say to everybody that's here today, it's in the audience, thank you for being here. Thanks for supporting NGA. Thanks for creating a platform and opportunity for the governors to come together, learn from each other, and help advance policies and practices that make our country stronger. So thank you to all of you. And I'm going to thank our panelists in a second. We have an awesome panel. This could be the greatest panel ever assembled related to building better communities. No matter that it may be the first one assembled, but it is going to be the greatest, most awesome one ever. Why does this matter to the governors? Why does it matter to all of us? Everyone knows that in our country right now, one of the biggest gating factors to our growth is workforce. We are at first time in the history of the country where we've got more people that are more jobs available than there are people looking for jobs. So this is an inversion compared to what we've had before, and it's likely to continue for another decade when we've got more baby boomers retiring than we've got people entering the workforce. And so in that competition for workforce and that competition for skilled workforces, there's a lot of elements, and we often talk about education and workforce training. But one thing that we know with the mobility of today's young workers is, which is different than 20 years ago or 40 or 50 years ago, they often pick the community first and the job second. So building healthy, vibrant communities are key to attracting workforce. And when we talk about building healthy, vibrant communities, one of the keys to doing that, to make sure that they're tax efficient, that they've got low property taxes, you get into the challenges of managing communities because governors don't get a chance to tell a local school board, a local city commission, a local park board exactly how to do their business. And then those local communities also are dealing with a huge amount of federal subsidies that come in, often through the DOT or others that might distort how those cities are built. And so we have had really since the end of World War II, a pattern of development in our communities that's centered around automobiles and not around people. This has led to a lot of other secondary costs, including the healthcare costs we have in our nation, $4 trillion out of a $17 trillion economy. 1/4 of that $4 trillion relates to the fact that Americans just walk less than other cultures do because of how we've designed our cities. And so we have an opportunity to think about smart cities and smart communities. We've got a couple of experts here whose organizations help do that. And so we're going to get in and talk about that, because I know you've all heard about smart grids and smart buildings and smart streets. And so this is an opportunity for everybody to get smart on smart. The two great panelists that we have here. First to my left, Kathy Engelbert had a fantastic career, 33 years with Deloitte, and I think we could spend the rest of the panel reading all the awards that you've won. We won't do that, but named multiple times to Fortune's list, most powerful women in business, top 50 working moms. It goes on and on and on. But one thing which I know I'm sure pleased about is Glassdoor, which has an opportunity for team members to rate their CEOs, that you've been in the top 100 of that. So literally we can say voted one of the top 100 CEOs in the country. And then the other thing for the governors that's interesting, when you get to the very top of Deloitte Tooth, a 100,000 person organization which has operations in every one of our states and most territories, it's a 4-year term when you get to actually lead the firm. And so Kathy is within a month or so of being termed out. And so there's nothing holding her back. She's not running for re-election, so she's just going to go crazy on this panel and share everything that she's learned over her career, which has been great. So we got that. And then to her left, we've got Philip Measy. Philip was with Itron. Itron is an organization which literally helps build smart cities. He's got a background in technology, software development, leadership management across a number of things, understands the utility business inside out. We're going to hear some really fun specific ideas because they're working with communities all over the country about how to build smart cities. But let me just kick it off, and first, Kathy, take it away and talk a little bit about Deloitte's practice, how you interact with state and local government, and how you're helping people build smart communities.
Yeah, I think the first thing is, obviously you come from a state that has rural areas, and the first thing to do is that we see and we help with is to assess what is the digital divide in your state. Is it rural urban? Is it suburban urban? Is it socioeconomic, or is it something because we have 5 generations in the workforce today, and I know we're 75% millennial at Deloitte, and I step back and think about their favorite 5 words is there's an app for that. So if you think about those 5 words, they're looking for this relentless focus on their experience, taking the friction out of life for them as a citizen in your community. So that's one of the things we see the most of. And we all know that just putting sensors in, just getting data, there's 2.5 quintillion bytes of data a day, but only 0.5% of them are actually used or analyzed. And if you really think about that and think about the power of that, and I know we're going to talk a little later about data being the new oil, you think about smart states, smart cities, smart nations. If you don't live in a smart home, smart car, smart city or state nation, you will soon. So no matter whether you're in a rural or urban area. And I think one of the other things is around, connectivity. We all are investing in the shiny new tool or technology, AI, social, mobile, blockchain, AR, VR. And I think as governors, we really can step back and advise you on how to actually build a strategy that actually makes an impact without maybe being an expert. But you're the conveners of all the agencies and even can help the cities who are really working hard on these smart cities initiatives. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We see a lot going on at the city level. And I think at the state level is something certainly we look forward to as well.
Great, thank you. And Philip, not only in the US, Itron working in over 100 countries with 8,000 different communities. So probably some best practices you can share from there as well, but thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Governor. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Itron focuses on, with cities and utilities, on the secure, reliable, and economic delivery of critical infrastructure. What does that mean? We've connected over 200 million electric, gas, and water meters. Increasingly, we're connecting street lighting and other types of sensors that are involved in smart communities. We run a number of energy efficiency programs and connected buildings and how to balance supply and demand of energy. That's important because 5 to 7% of electricity is lost in the distribution system, 1 to 3% of natural gas, and importantly for cities and states, 30% of water that's put into the water distribution system is lost before it gets down to the end consumer. And as an example, I live in California. The largest use of electricity is the pumping and purification of water. Almost 20% of electricity is used in the delivery of water. So when we waste water, we're wasting energy. And so one of the areas that we first think about when we think about smart communities is building more efficient, sustainable, and reliable communities, focusing on energy efficiency, water efficiency, and programs to help improve livability, like connected street lighting, which have an impact on crime, and also give us the opportunity to start building networks to cover cities that allow us to put all kinds of different devices. You mentioned building around roads. 30% of congestion and air quality problems in downtowns are really cars circling around looking for parking. And there are very innovative solutions once you have connected solutions to route cars to proper parking and do a much more efficient job of how cities operate. You mentioned the fact that Itron does quite a lot in the rest of the world, and there's a lot for us to learn in projects that we've done in places like Paris, Copenhagen, but also developing countries, to keep our solutions simple to the extent that they're possible and really focus on economics. And then to focus also on, while we've done a lot of work in major metropolitan areas working with utilities, we also have very, very broad coverage, particularly in the water space where we have over 55,000 water utilities that are municipalities. And so we've done quite a lot of work with companies like Montana Dakota Utilities that have interesting challenges where I looked on their website, they say they cover 5% of the lower 48 in land mass, but they're 410,000 customers. So you have to focus on technologically innovative and economical solutions to be able to connect all of those customers in really innovative ways and provide users with better information about how they're using resources.
I'm going to share a thesis, and I'll come back to you with a question. The thesis is that technology has disrupted every job, every company, every industry. We all know that. But I think the disruption has not been equal because in some places like software where, Steve Case has spent his life, wide open, no barriers, no tariff, tremendous competition. So, rapid cycle of innovation. In places where we've had federal government intervention and regulation, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in higher education, where there have been either subsidies or regulation, they have been insulated a little bit from this. And I would also put government in that category, along with healthcare and education, as being one of the categories that has more disruption ahead of it than it's already been achieved. One of the things that we know with technology, with all the sensor technology, because now every one of us is carrying a supercomputer around in our pocket, which is a pervasive mobility with pervasive ability to track not just us, but all the activities we do. We do have an opportunity to have this Internet of Things, which you're both talking about, and automatically collected data is of higher quality and of lower cost than human collected data. And when we have human collected data, when we ask doctors and nurses to put their hands on a keyboard, a 1960s invention, we're asking for high cost data and low quality. Versus the things that both of you were talking about was automatically collected. So maybe I'll just kick it right back to Philip and come back to Kathy, but talk a little bit about what the Internet of Things could mean, about the advances of automatically collected data, how you're analyzing all that data. When 30% of the water is not even getting there, you're figuring that out now automatically, then what do we do with some of these problems?
We are. So maybe just two things to talk about there. Starting out with efficiency, how do we target where waste occurs? And how do we better inform consumers about their impact, how they're using things like electricity, gas, and water, or other municipal services? So our ability to both use sensor data to pinpoint where efficiency problems occur, but also better interact with citizens in ways to allow them to change their behavior in very productive ways, I think is important. Yesterday we had a jam session talking about infrastructure and infrastructure funding. It's an overwhelming problem. What I see one of the highest values of the smart data is being able to very intelligently target where the most acute problems are and allowing us to really prioritize infrastructure investments in a way that we couldn't before. We were relying upon largely human expertise in order to determine how capital was allocated in cities and states. And I think we now have the opportunity with smart analytics to be able to look at very specific problems, some of them not that intuitive, places that we can target investment to really improve outcomes.
And let's go back even to the very basics of your industry, the meter reader. Where we are in our country in terms of having humans collect meter data versus it being automatically collected. How many jobs was that? How many have transitioned? And what are you able to do with the data when you're automatically collecting it?
Yeah, so we're at about, in the US, we're at about 60 to 70% penetration for automatic collection of this kind of information. There are still a number of areas where the economics of putting out these networks are not there yet, and so still opportunity for growth for us. And you mentioned that this is an automation of taking field people out from the meter reading task, but those programs we've worked with our utilities who are retraining that staff in order now to focus on where are we having asset reliability problems, where can we do a better job at restoration. I mean, there are all kinds of tasks that were done reactively that are now being done more proactively because the staff has been retrained and retargeted to really think about ways to create better outcomes.
And repurposed to a higher value activity.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Well,
Kathy,
maybe I'll add on you talked about jobs being disrupted, and maybe I'll just add, we have now 7.3 million jobs unfilled in the US. There is a huge skills gap. We have, we're looking at, tech savvy, digital academies. I think it starts with education. We all know education drives a better job, better healthcare, better living conditions. And so while the skill set mismatch is not a smart city, smart state type issue per se, I mean, it's a huge issue when you have access issues to good education and you ultimately have jobs that we can't fill this mismatch. And one of the things we've been doing at the Business Roundtable is loading skill sets into a database. We never had an inventory of that. And so kids who are in college and hopefully their parents are influencing them or teachers can say, here are the skills that are most wanted to be hired, and now we have to work with universities and again this whole ecosystem to make sure that we can get a little more skills matching, because today, especially as you say, in rural areas, I think the prediction is that 68% of the population will live in cities by 2050. Now, where's that going to leave the rural areas? You know, we can put all the sensors and smart infrastructure and everything, but you know, if everyone's going to move to the cities, and the cities already have failing infrastructure, many of them, as we know, and that's a topic probably we could spend the whole day on. But this is part of the challenge, and it is an interrelated issue to, you know, how we think about the worker of tomorrow and how we think about the skills mismatch. I mean, 7.3 million. By the way, a year ago it was only 5.8 million. So, I mean, this mismatch is growing, and it's one of the things we worry about a lot.
We'll come back to rural, but I know that, Kathy, you guys have practice with your public sector practice or touching really every state. And as you talked about in your opening remarks, collecting a lot of data. Tell us a little bit about what Deloitte's doing on the front edge of machine learning, of artificial intelligence, how you're applying that to the data, and how you're helping local or state communities to be smarter with the data they have.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is, as Philip just referred to, is what to do with the data. I hear all the time, we're drowning in data and starving for insights. So how can you, again, have people who have higher level analytics skills? I have a daughter in college, and I told her no matter what you do, you're taking analytics, which is really just higher level statistics from when we all went to school. And she did follow my advice, by the way, one thing she listened to at least. But I think the key is data modernization. And really, I don't know how many states have a chief data officer, and how you probably need to elevate that position in your organizations to be a really important kind of cog, because you are the conveners at the state level, and only you can help drive a data modernization program. You can help drive, obviously, the privacy issues, the cyber issues, and that's a lot of what we get called in to do to help states and cities, and obviously companies as well, who all every day are living with the risks as you modernize your data governance. They're dealing with the risks of this balance between, you know, building out a strategy and a plan that's based on connectivity and mobility, and then also but protecting data, but having then transparency, which is what citizens, your citizens are all becoming data scientists themselves. And so again, how do you strike that balance? A lot of what we do is the governance around data and how to set that up. But I mean, my ask of the governors here today is really to elevate the chief data officer and help them be a convener of all the agencies, because again, forget the connectivity outside your world, it's the connectivity within your world that I think is going to be important as we go forward to analyzing this data and protecting it, as well as being transparent, because again, this relentless focus on the citizen's experience. You know, you look at some cities, we didn't talk about what some of the cities are doing, but Chicago, Boston, New York, over in Europe, there's cities that are basically building apps. I think it was Buenos Aires that's actually built an app for their citizens to find potholes, and I'm sure this is a lot what you do, and it brought down the time to fix these things by 93%. You know, how would I, as a citizen today living in the Northeast with lots of potholes because of the snow we've gotten this year, I would feel a lot better about where I live if I was able to report that, take a picture. You know, in Buenos Aires, I think they inventoried 1 million physical objects before they did that. So you need actually a pretty comprehensive plan to deal with this. And it's complex, but you need to elevate it, I think, and have the, you know, the way I look at it, it's like a symphonic, you know, you need to get all the agencies working symphonically on these issues. And again, with this shift to urbanization, I think for your cities, for your city's sake, this is going to be something you have to invest in and have to do.
Philip, I saw you nodding when you were talking about the customer experience side of this thing and the customer interaction, because you must have millions of customers across all these thousands of communities. So talk a little bit about.
I mean, we do, and one of the great challenges that our customers, generally utilities and municipalities, are feeling is that you get more information about the car that's going to pick you up or the status of your flight than you do about the municipal services that you receive, and in particular the kinds of utilities and, you know, the commodities you're consuming. So there's a lot of citizen pressure for much more timely and accurate information, and so we're working very closely with our customers on how they can better provide that information. And by the way, one of the keys to that is to embrace open standards to unlock innovation and allow lots of other players to come in and think of new ways to sort and present this information in innovative ways. I think one of the things that stifles innovation is thinking that cities or government or utilities or even companies like ours are going to come up with the best answers. We need to we need to create an environment, an ecosystem that allows other people to develop ideas, because there is an incredible wealth of innovation out there that we could tap into. And then maybe just to follow up on something that Kathy said, I absolutely agree that we need to think about smart communities and how we're going to embrace this kind of technology in very holistic ways. But we also have to look for early wins and very specific projects that have quick payback, that are kind of anchor tenants for this sort of a system. And we've seen that as an example with street lighting, where there's a project underway to re-lamp for LEDs, which are 70% more energy efficient, to use that as an opportunity to actually hang the network infrastructure that then builds a canopy that allows for things like air quality, traffic sensing, public safety, all kinds of other applications that we're starting to really pilot and take a look at. But it's not, let's invest in infrastructure and hope that a business problem comes our way. Let's manage our economic risk by solving a specific problem about street lighting, about energy efficiency, about crime, and then build with the technology that we put in place, build outward from that, as opposed to kind of trying to boil the ocean, which could be very intimidating.
And one of the things we get asked is, how do I pay for this? How do I fund this? For every dollar investment in broadband, apparently there's $4 of return on that. And if you think about public-private partnerships, you think about the first DOT, Department of Transportation grant to Columbus, Ohio, who won the Smart Cities Challenge. So that was a grant of $40 million, matched by philanthropic funds of 10, and then private sector $100 million. So now they have $150 million to go figure out, what a smart city might really look like. So this can be done now. It's very early days, but I do think as we're at for 2 years we've been talking about we're at the dawn of the fourth industrial revolution, where we're fusing our physical, digital, and biological worlds. We need the public and private sector to partner on this, because otherwise, as we always say on infrastructure, we say it here too, because this is just one element of infrastructure. I think it's important, and it dovetails into all the other things we talked about: access to education, clean water, energy efficiencies. And some cities have proven the return is there. The return is there.
And when you talk about infrastructure, my sense is that when there's a conversation in our country about infrastructure, people often think about roads and bridges, as opposed to all the digital infrastructure, this overarching platform, which could lead to hundreds of solutions to address all kinds of problems. When your sense of working with local and state governments, is the dialogue shifting? Are the budgets starting to follow, building out the infrastructure we need for the digital age, or are we still stuck in building cities for automobiles?
I think it's still a combination of both. The question is, you're the CEOs of the states here, as the governors, and you have finite funding, and the city's mayors the same thing. And how do you choose to allocate that capital amongst the initiatives when you have people saying the traffic's untenable, there's no parking, you're taking a big hit to the economy, there's not energy efficiency, and so I think there's a little bit of a shift, probably not as fast as I thought it was going to happen, because I thought the citizen was really going to demand it. And I think what's happened, it's been a little less kind of in the news, given the broader infrastructure, the bridges and tunnels type and highways type narrative that plays much better in this town than the digital highways.
Before we get to digital, I'd love to extend the discussion of infrastructure to include our electricity, gas, and water grids. The things that make us a first world country are the reliability of this infrastructure. When it's disrupted, it's terrible for our society, incredibly economically wasteful. So what I've seen as a change is that with a greater focus on resiliency of systems, we've seen a greater willingness for state utility commissions to approve grid modernization efforts. And we still have a tremendous need for water infrastructure, which is where this 30% of water leaking comes out. But in the gas and water space, we've seen very strong investments, and those investments have come with digital infrastructure. When we talk about a kind of a public-private collaboration, I would really encourage all of you to think about the significant investments that your utility commissions and legislatures have approved with your investor-owned utilities, that they have now built out significant digital infrastructure that you might be able to share or to piggyback on top of, rather than duplicatively building separate systems to monitor electricity, gas, water, lighting, parking, all of these things. Let's not rebuild duplicative infrastructure. Let's really focus on how it is that we can get more value out of the digital investments that we've already made.
Both of you have mentioned parking or the cost of people circling to find parking. I mean, now we've entered an age where we've got multiple ride-sharing companies that have been highly successful. There'll be other alternatives that come in terms of whether it's package delivery or whatever it happens to be, but we're going to end up with collaborative consumption model as opposed to every family owns, 1, 2, or 3 automobiles, and then we have to have the commensurate parking. When I talk about America loving automobiles and building cities for cars, we're really actually been focusing on the parking of those cars because there's about 10 to 12 spots for every vehicle, and we have a lot of vehicles. It's been suggested that the size of surface parking in America is larger than Connecticut, and the value of the land for all the parking in America is greater than the value of all the automobiles in America. That's how much not only we love, the thing we love more than cars is we love free parking. And if anyone on the governor's staff wants, there's a 750-page book called The High Cost of Free Parking. I wouldn't recommend it for any of you, but someone on your staff may want to read it because it really details the economic cost of this. But let's talk about smart cities. In a future, in 10 years, what do we do with all the parking spaces that we may not need if we've got more collaborative consumption? How is that going to be retasked, into mixed use with appropriate economically functioning use of space in the cities you're in? And how does it affect the multimodal? Because you guys are both doing work overseas. I mean, I'm driving around DC. It was 55 degrees, and I think I did see in the bike lanes, I did see 2 bikers daringly taking their time on the bike. If you were in Copenhagen or Amsterdam, you'd see 500,000 commuters on bikes in essentially the same weather conditions. So tell us a little about the U.S. And of course, there's a lot of health benefits when we go multimodal. And then of course, then people say, I'm not going to ride a bike. Who'd ride a bike? But then there's new technology around bike and collaborative consumption on bikes and powered bikes, like you saw our chairman Governor Bullock riding at the last NGA meeting. I mean, there's a lot of bike advancements that are coming and scooter advancements that are really going to get there. And I think that we've got a generation of age of decision makers who spent their whole lives in cars. I know my kids, I dragged them around in car seats. They're a generation that doesn't want to drag their kids around in car seats. They want the world to go multimodal. So how does Smart Cities support this transition?
Yeah, so I think this is something to really be thought out in a master plan. I call it a master plan around smart cities and smart nations. There is a lot of data out there that would say, we maybe overestimate in 10 years that no one will be driving cars. So I do think that's maybe a little overestimated. But there's also, I think, a little underestimation in the short term of how the millennials and the digital natives, these Gen Zs that are joining our ranks today as paying citizens of taxes and having jobs, are going to want their mobility and their science. I mean, the fact that we have an app called Waze that can tell you where a pothole is on a road, where a policeman is on the road, or whether there's something an animal on the side of the road, and guess who's giving all that data in? It's the citizen. It's the person who's actually on the road. And so given the vastness of this issue and whether we really think autonomous vehicles and the ethical aspects of that, and I'm sure the governors has started to think about that. I know the federal government has as well. I think it's a great issue to continue to talk about, Governor. I just don't think it's going to happen as quickly maybe as you do. And I think that it'll depend, again, on these digital natives that are coming into the workforce today. If there is this shift to urbanization, 65% living in cities, will they adopt the bike culture? I see it more in New York City every year over the past couple years. I still think we're going to be driving in cars in 10 years. So I don't think there's...
I want to be clear, I do too, but I do think we've got an issue in our country where we've got zero tolerance for air traffic deaths. We've had 1 commercial death, 1 person in 9 years in the U.S. So we demand that. We kill about 40,000 people a year on the roads.
On the road.
And I think that with autonomous assist, I mean, maybe we can cut that in half in 10 years. I mean, we'll still have people on the roads, but we have an opportunity to improve that, and we have an opportunity to improve the economics of our cities because of the high cost associated. And of course, we all want families to have more take-home pay. If we can lower their transportation costs through collaborative consumption, that's a good thing as well.
The way I think about this, because we can argue about adoption rates, are what are the no regrets investments that we need to make today that are going to enable this future to unfold for us? And Kathy pointed out what the power of Waze, but things that provide us with a connected view of what's going on inside a city are going to be critical for that. And what I've read about vehicles it's likely electric vehicles that are going to be involved in this revolution. So we focus on charging infrastructure, ways of dealing with discreetly measuring who's used what and where they're going. That really kind of unlocks the possibilities here for the adoption rate to kind of work itself out.
Yeah, and I think that's important as a driver of an electric vehicle. For instance, yesterday I went into a garage, there were 10 chargers there were no other cars there, and none of the 10 worked. And it was a utility company that had the sign that said free charging here. But I think we have a long way to go, as we did with cell. And just a point on 5G that we haven't really gotten into. I am a huge believer that, and we're going to pilot 5G in some of the pieces of our organization to make sure that we're at the forefront of what that means for us and our highly mobile and highly diverse workforce. So that is something I think, if you're not all investing in this through whether it's partnering with companies like yours, partnering with obviously the cellular companies. I know AT&T is doing a lot of work, and they have the FirstNet contract to connect first responders. But this is going to be so key because there's massive quantum computing and other things that are going to be required if we're ever going to get to autonomous driving and all these other things we're talking about.
Great. We want to open it up to questions from governors in the next section. And while governors are thinking about what they may want to ask, both of you touched on cyber. And again, when we have these pervasive networks that are tracking all these different activities, we're collecting a lot of data on citizens, and some people might be feeling that there's a big brother element in that. What do we do to make sure in an age of state-sponsored cyber attacks that are hitting every one of our states every day, hitting many of our municipalities every day? It's just a fact of life. Talk a little bit about what your firms are doing and how you think about cybersecurity.
Sure. We've put, as you've heard, hundreds of millions of devices out in the field. They are embedded with military-grade security that's been tested by our US DOE labs with very active penetration testing. You, as governors, have asked your utility commissions to be very, very thoughtful about setting very high standards for critical infrastructure. And so we are regulated in a rigorous way in order to ensure the safety and security of the equipment that we're putting out in the field. And one can never rest there. It requires ongoing vigilance. But we have done extensive work in this area. You mentioned the second issue beyond cybersecurity of data privacy, which I think is also critically important to maintain the confidence of citizens that this information is being used for the proper purposes. So we've also done a lot of work on how it is that we appropriately protect customer citizen-based information.
Yeah, just a couple adds on to that. So privacy, so obviously we have GDPR in Europe, we have California. So the question is, are we going to have 50 different privacy laws that companies and others will have to abide by? Is that the right answer? Should we have one national type of privacy type of thing? And this whole data collection and privacy, and I know with a daughter who's a digital native graduating from college, she's not as obsessed with this. When she got her driver's license, she posted it right on Instagram. And I said, do you realize there's personally identifiable information? She's like, what's PII, Mom? Because I use the acronym. So I do think there's a transparency balance with this, but cyber is something that's never going to go away. Obviously, we do a lot of work in this area for companies, for governments, for the states, and this is something that I think as you look at any kind of, what we actually call it at Deloitte, we're doing our own cyber acceleration plan. You can throw all the money at it you want, but you've got to inventory and prioritize what is the most important and sensitive data and focus your efforts there first. And companies tend to spread it like peanut butter, and that's not going to work. So one of our advice is to inventory, prioritize, make sure you have, you're secure, vigilant, and resilient.
Okay, Governor Bevan.
Just a quick question. If you look at, you talk about data, it's certainly, we have more and more of it. The key is to manage it and build it and use it in algorithms that serve a constructive purpose. Talk about energy. We've just been talking about cyber. A concern I have, and I wonder, do you share it? And if so, what ideas would you have that we should be thinking of as a nation as relates to the energy grid itself, obviously the cybersecurity of it, leaving that aside for a moment, just the sheer reliability of it. When you think about the sources of it now and the ways in which those sources are fed into the grid, they are disruptible. They are diverse in ways they weren't historically, which is fantastic, but both due to terrorism and or cyber attack and or just geological disruption in the form of an earthquake or what have you, there are ways they can be disrupted in ways that are new. What concerns do you have about that, and what suggestions would you make? Because when you look at, for example, this 72-hour polar vortex, created a tremendous amount of disruption and even rolling brownouts and concern in places that have historically not had concern, and idling of plants that was very economically disruptive. And yet that was 72 hours. What if it had been 7 to 10 days? I just wonder your thoughts on this as a concern, and what suggestions from each of your perspectives would you make that to the Department of Energy and the federal government and to us as governors as to what we should be thinking about to get out in front of this?
Before you answer that question, I say I wanted Governor Bevan, the question is, what do we call the polar vortex in North Dakota?
Yeah, that would be like
January.
March, exactly. I was going to guess March.
Yeah, exactly. March would be better, but yeah. January. Okay, go ahead.
Well, there are many levels to this. As we look at a central generation model that has been the prevalent way that we've delivered energy in this country over the past 100 years, we are now distributing more of our energy generation in the form of renewables and other techniques to create, in some ways, greater resiliency in the generation portfolio. We do have to be sensitive, of course, to high-level disruption in the generation fleet and in the transmission system. We tend to work at the distribution level. The experience of our customers, an example, Hurricane Harvey, Houston is the city of Houston and the Houston utility are customers of ours. 25% reduction in overall outage, 45 million outage minutes saved in Irma, 4.5 million disrupted customers at Florida Power and Light, over half of which were restored within 24 hours, the remainder several days after that. That this kind of smart infrastructure and awareness allows us to understand situationally what's going on and resolve problems much more quickly. So the technology can be very powerful for supporting a more diverse grid of energy sources that are flowing in multiple directions, and also allowing us, as problems develop, to be able to target problem areas more effectively. And in the case of the polar vortex, by being able to work with customers signaling thermostats in smart homes and buildings in order to adjust demand in order to deal with inevitable disruptions.
Great. We'll go with Governor Cooper and then Governor Sisolak.
We know that workforce and technology is a challenge right now, both for private and public. And particularly in the public, we struggle to get the kind of technology employees that we need. We're able to talk people into doing their public duty and perfect public service for a while, some stellar people. But consequently, governments have to turn to private companies, and we get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pitches from companies with technology ideas, with how to make your city smart. We're working in a realm where we don't have the flexibility or the nimbleness of a private company. Advice to governors on how to approach technology, which we know we need, but going at a slower pace than the private sector.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So obviously, to the extent that you can elevate the chief, I'm sure you have CISOs and chief technology officers, but this chief data officer, chief digital officer, I do think that people, especially millennials, want to be much more driven by purpose-driven work. So if your narrative on a state is come work for us, and although we may not be, you know, one of the Facebook, Apple, Google, Netflix type companies, you know, getting your narrative right to hire in the appropriate resources. And again, I think this starts back at the university level and making sure we're driving a more tech-savvy population that can come join us at the younger ages rather than you having to hire a very expensive, very sought after by the private sector technology expert. So I think there are ways to do it with the right narrative about the purpose-driven work that you do at the state level, and that people can really make an impact and a difference. So I do think it's possible. I just don't think, as you brand yourself, I don't think the right narrative is out there to go work in state government today. And I think, you know, there's probably some, you know, rebranding that can be done that could fix that. I really do. I think these millennials, they want to be known as tech savvy. They want to be driven in technology jobs, but they don't necessarily want to work in government today. And I think this is about the narrative and the brand.
I agree with that. Governor?
Thank you. What could be done, and I appreciate you answered part of it with your last answer, to provide some of these employment opportunities for this next generation that's coming along? I mean, where do we start? The university level is too late to get them involved in this. What is your recommendation or your advice on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we have something we said there's 50 million public high school students out there, hard to make an impact. There's 2.3 million teachers, hard to make an impact. But there's, you know, 150,000 principals. So we launched something called Courageous Principals, where we're working with them, because if they're better administrators and understand how we need to build tech savvy, that's a way to get it. Now, how do you scale it? How do you get that impact on our public high school systems? Because I know in New York City, we've driven our graduation rates in a decade up from, you know, the mid-30s to 75%. But only 30% are viewed as college or career ready. And especially, why do we have 7.3 million jobs available out there? This is why. So I do think there's things we can do. I think it's another public-private sector collaboration that has got to be done. I know we're trying to do a lot of things with cities and states in this area. I know a lot of other companies are, but we all need the talent, and we need to actually be a feeder into your organizations with the talent. So I'm not saying there's an easy answer here, but I'm a little more optimistic on this, you know, that we can have an impact.
If I could follow up, just is high school too late? Do we need to move it back into the middle schools or into the? I'm just kind of wondering, because I understand we have the same graduation problem with high school students.
I think in the middle school, I think these kids are digital natives. That's what they're called, this Gen Z, digital natives. So I think they actually have the skills even in middle school. It's when you pull them into high school as to what they then want to select to go to college for, or community college, or, you know, technical school, or whatever it is. And that's why this kind of inventorying all the skills that are needed to be hired and matching those up to the companies that are hiring. I tend to think that happens more in high school. Clearly, we could go back as far as second grade on how kids are digitally inclined today, but I do think high school is where it turns, especially in the inner cities, where it turns, you know, plus or minus.
Last question, Governor Gordon from Wyoming.
Well, thank you, and you know, it's exciting to talk about all the technology. Just as an example, Microsoft is putting a new data center in Wyoming next to our biggest town. That data center is going to use more electricity than our entire city. So the question I guess I have is on how do you build the capital to be able to power all of that infrastructure? Because it is wonderful that we have this technology, but at this point it's sort of accelerating at a very rapid rate without having kind of the concept of how we fund this over time and what it's going to mean.
You hire Philip.
Yeah, so since 2008, total electricity usage in North America has been flat. It declined after the recession and is hardly recovered. It's just about to cross back to where it was in 2008. The ongoing focus on energy efficiency, many projections indicate that total electricity demand will not actually increase nationally. And so while we can build more infrastructure and should, energy efficiency is a tremendous way to offset the needs of things like new data centers in order to create a net balanced environment.
Great. We're going to close with a North Dakota lightning round. Kathy talked about rebranding. We've rebranded North Dakota. Having every tech company I worked with had a mission statement. State of North Dakota didn't. We now have one, 6 words: empower people, improve lives, inspire success. We think it touches everything that 51 different agencies in the state work on, and we know that people want to work for a place with a purpose, so we're really pushing forward on that because we don't have the right value proposition to attract the talent, as Governor Cooper was saying, so we've got to try to work with everything we have. Number 2 is smart roads. We have a test going on a section of our busiest road section. We're burying optic fiber in there. We can tell the difference between a truck, a motorcycle, a pedestrian, when there's a slowdown beginning, ice conditions, temperature right around freezing. We can decide, do we send the trucks out to plow or to provide some kind of applicant to the road? But we can do that when we've got better information versus waiting till the accidents start happening and then sending people out. On broadband, North Dakota is number 2 in the country. We're shooting for number 1 broadband for not just our communities, but every school. We're going for the first state that's got gigabit access in every school, every community. But we're also working with Microsoft on TV white spaces, which is like rural high-speed wireless, so we can get to every combine, every tractor, every rancher on a horse with a smartphone. So we're in progress about that, and that will also help us support. We're building out the first UAS air traffic control system. Today there's about 500,000 manned aircraft in the country. About 50,000 of them at any point in time are in the air, and we've got very safe airspace. We could, in a period of 10 to 20 years, have 1 million UAS flying around. They're going to be flying. How do we detect and avoid? How do we do that? We have one of the first test sites to fly beyond visual line of sight in North Dakota, but we're going to build it out and go statewide with a network, because then we can do precision agriculture. We can do transmission lines. We can do pipelines better than humans can with flying. And to help prove out that we got the ability to do that, we did have the Lindbergh flight for US. We flew a 41-foot wingspan drone at 7,000 feet from Grand Forks, North Dakota. It landed in Britain safely, 3,700 nautical miles, 24 hours and 2 minutes, to prove out that we can fly these things, and we can certainly fly them around our state. So that's on the UAS front. And then you talked earlier about every citizen getting involved. As we talked about our Main Street initiative of healthy, vibrant cities, attracting the workforce we need, and having smart infrastructure. One of the ways we've done that for all the locally elected government, we've created dashboards for all the Main Street committees. We're pulling data from about 40 different locations, putting it up on a dashboard for every city. So a part-time local elected official will be able to look at all the data they need for their city, and that won a Government Experience Award from the Center for Digital Government last year. So shout out to our small, heroic team in North Dakota of IT people that are working to try to make that done. So anyway, we're at the end. I want to thank Philip Measy, CEO of Itron, Kathy Engelbert, CEO of Deloitte. Let's give them a hand. Thank you for sharing your expertise and being with us today.
Thank you so much.